Okay, now let's talk about the sequence I keep talking about that we see. This is something that took me a while of going through episodes to figure out. So pretty much with every single one of these death fakeouts, this is what you can find. Um, if you really analyze what's going on. And sometimes you have to analyze several seasons. It doesn't happen all at once. Okay, so first of all, there is a foreshadow of it that is not obvious until later. So the best example of this is probably that episode with Rick and Michonne, 712. So funny story. At the end, they both have this heart to heart together while they're sitting in the van talking about how if one of them loses the other person has to lead and stay the course and be there for the people, and they can't, become a puddle of goo on the floor because they lost, their significant other. And me and my fellow theorists talked about that. We were going, okay, that is so clearly a foreshadow of something, but we really don't see them killing off Rick or Michonne. So what is this a foreshadow of? And we couldn't figure it out. We had no idea. The next season 8, Carl died. And we kind of wondered if maybe it was a foreshadow of Carl. I mean, they didn't really say that if we lose one of the kids, but we thought, well, maybe it was just their way of not being obvious and saying that they still need to keep going even though they lost him. So we kind of wondered if maybe that was the fulfillment of that foreshadow from 712. Well, it wasn't until after season 8 ended that people learned that Rick was leaving the show and that he was going to end up, we didn't know how it would happen, but it was him getting taken by the CRM. Okay, so then when we learned that, we were like, oh, that's what that was about. Okay, so he's not actually dying, but he is leaving the show. Okay, so this is what I mean when I say a foreshadow that's not always obvious until later. Okay, we had no idea what that meant when it first aired, but in hindsight, we can see it, and that happens all the time on the show, guys. Okay, all the time. All right, so that's the first one. There's a foreshadow that's not always obvious until later. The second one is that their romantic relationship is previously established in some way. This is true of all the couples. It's not like, and I think this is why you can very clearly say that, even before we knew what we know now, that Connie and Daryl were not going to be a thing, because there was a death fake out with her, and he did lose her for a while as a friend and was very happy to see her, and they reunited and all of that, but there was not a previously established romantic relationship there. So they just don't count as a death fake out couple. Okay, so before the fake out happens, the couple always goes through what I call a trial separation. Okay, this is not the actual fake out. It's a shorter separation before the fake out happens. So it's almost like they do this little separation that is its own little mini foreshadow of the fake out itself. Okay, and I'll go through what this looks like in just a minute. At the beginning of the trial separation, so not at the beginning of the fake out, but at the beginning of a trial separation, a place is usually lost. They lose somewhere that was once their home. The one who actually has the fake out, who is presumed dead, they tend to wake up in another place without their significant other, and the camera specifically zooms in on their eyes as they flutter open, okay? We've seen this in 2 out of the 4 death fake outs. Like I said, we haven't seen Zeke's yet, so I guess I should say 2 out of 3 of the death fake outs. We haven't seen it with Rick, but I know we will. We know that they're doing Rick Grimes films, or however that ends up, looking when they figure it out. I think we're going to see this with him. He's going to wake up inside the CRM and his eyes will flutter open and we will see it. Okay, and then the couple always comes back together after the trial separation, and they are kind of like happy together for a very short time, and then the death fake out happens. Okay, that's happened every single time too. And the other thing is, and this is kind of conjecture on my part because we have only seen this in 1 out of the 4 death fake outs thus far. But after the fake out, the other member of the couple who, thought that their significant other was dead has to realize they're alive, and they do have a time of happiness together. And the reason I included that is because the only person that we've actually seen this with is Glenn and Maggie. Okay, so after the fake out, he comes back, he's alive, it's all good, and they have a time of happiness together. But it's important to realize that one of the characters can still die after that. Okay, Glenn really did die when Negan showed up, but after the death fake out, he did come back to Maggie. There was a reunion, and they had a very short time of happiness together before he was actually killed. Okay, and I think that will be the same. I'm not saying that all of these characters are going to die afterward, but I'm just saying they will have to come back together and have this time of happiness before anything else happens. It's just part of the sequence that is required. Okay, so now we are going to go through, and I'm just going to show you this. We'll start with Glenn and Maggie. Where was their foreshadow? I believe the foreshadow was when Glenn became sick with the virus, okay? If you go back and watch those episodes in 4A, what is done and said very much sounds like Glenn is going to die from the virus. Maggie talks about losing him, about wanting to be with him again, and part of that is because they're all quarantined, so she can't actually be beside him and hold his hand. But I think that was a foreshadow of, losing him and the death fake out and all of that. Obviously, the relationship was previously established because Glenn and Maggie have been canon since season 2 and from the comic books and everything. Their trial separation happened in 4B, and that is when the prison went down and they got separated from each other, okay? They were looking for each other the entire time, and that was their trial separation. It wasn't a fake out, right? We didn't think either of them was dead, but it was just that they were separated. I already said that the place that was lost at the beginning of the trial separation was the prison. It went down, and then their trial separation began. When it comes to his eyes fluttering open, we actually saw this more during the trial separation than we did during the actual fake out, because he passes out after he and Tara leave the prison and he wakes up in the back of Abraham's truck. And they did do the thing where they really focused in on his eyes and they fluttered open, okay? But this was during the trial separation. When he pulled himself under the dumpster, we didn't specifically see his eyes flutter open like that, but we did see it both times, just in different places. And of course, Glenn and Maggie came back together in 415 after the trial separation, and then they stayed together, obviously, and were fine for a while before the death fake out happened. Now, it's important to notice that Glenn's death fake out didn't happen for more than a season after their trial separation, right? It didn't happen during season 5. It happened at the beginning of season 6. But in terms of, we all know that season 5 famously moved really slowly time-wise. So they probably, it wasn't like it was months or years. I mean, for them, it was probably only a few weeks, right? So just something to keep in mind, even though it can seem like a long time because it doesn't happen for several seasons, that doesn't mean that to them it was a long time. I don't think really time in the show factors into it very much. Okay, let's move on to Beth and Daryl. How was theirs foreshadowed? Well, take your pick, okay? There was a whole bunch of foreshadowing. We saw it in Still, we saw it in Alone, we saw it at the big spot. I mean, there's tons of different ways that they foreshadowed this. But one of the big ones is, Beth's famous line, sitting on the porch, "You're gonna miss me so bad when I'm gone." People immediately picked up on that one. I go, okay, one of them's going to die, because that's really obvious. And yeah, we don't think that either one of them died, obviously, but that was a big foreshadow. And then I felt like all of season 4 with the two of them was one great big foreshadow of this happening. Okay. I do believe that and this is a tricky one, their romantic relationship was established in episode 4, 12, and 13, which is Still and Alone. Now, no one who is a Betheler or a TDer is going to push back against that in any way. We knew that that was established, but it also was not canon. And so there are people who could say, well, yeah, but you said that because he and Connie were not romantic, that means he and Beth weren't, and things like that. But here's the thing. I couldn't really prove that in terms of what we saw in the show. Up until the last few months, okay? Because when the Daryl Origin episode aired, they confirmed that in that scene in Alone where they were having the dinner and he stared at her and she said, oh, they confirmed that he was hitting on her right there, okay? He felt like afterward that he misread the situation because she said, oh, and he thought she didn't reciprocate his feelings. But from what they said in that Origins episode, they did confirm that he had feelings for her, and that's what he was trying to convey in that scene. So even though they were super subtle about it, they really didn't tell us, on the nose about it, that was confirmation that their romance was previously established. And, we also actually, one thing we could point to from several years ago is that there were character bios that actually said that he conveyed his feelings for her in that scene. And when they posted those, everybody freaked out and they hurried and took them down. Okay, but it was obvious that that's what they were going for in that scene. Okay, so their relationship was previously established. Now, the trial separation, as you can probably guess, was when Beth went to Grady. Okay, that was not a death fake out. I don't know. It was a little bit of one because there were people who thought that she was killed and was like on the grill at Terminus. But overall, there aren't that many people who thought she was dead for sure. I mean, they didn't go out of their way to make us think she was dead. Let's put it that way. She was at Grady, which means they were apart. That was the trial separation. And of course, when she wakes up at Grady, we do see the eye flutter thing when she wakes up. Oh, I forgot to say, the place they lost in this case was the funeral home. And that may not seem like a very big deal, but remember, they were talking about staying there long term. So they did actually lose that as a place and leave it behind. Now, they came back together in the hallway at Grady during the episode Coda. Unlike Glenn and Maggie, they did not have a whole lot of time together to be happy before the death fake out happened. It was minutes, right? Just minutes, and then she got shot. So it was very short, which is different than Glenn and Maggie. And of course, we haven't actually seen them come back together like we did Glenn and Maggie, so we are still waiting on that. Okay, let's look at Rishon. Like I said, 7/12 was one great big foreshadow of Rick's death fake out. So that was where it was foreshadowed. Obviously, the relationship was canon because they went canon early in season 6 and they were already together as a couple. Pinning down Rick and Michonne's trial separation is a little bit harder. We're thinking that it was during season 8, during All Out War. And the reason for that is because they made a big deal about him saying goodbye to her when he went off to war at the beginning of the season. They said goodbye, they hugged, they kissed, as though they might never see each other again. And then we had a storyline kind of midway through the season, which was, all the same war. It moved very slowly because the whole thing was just, episode after episode of them continuing, like on the same day, the battle. Anyway, so they had this storyline where Michonne went out looking for Rick because she didn't know where he was or if he was okay, and there were some things going wrong that was making her worried. So she actually went out looking for him. We kind of think that was their trial separation. And then near the end of that, which is when we found out Carl had been bitten, they come back together at Alexandria. The place they lost was kind of around the same time, and the place they lost was Alexandria. Now, this isn't something that they left and never came back to. They did, but the place was bombed. You know what I mean? It wasn't going to be the same place as before, and they would have had to rebuild it. So they did kind of lose that as a place for a while, and they ended up going to Hilltop for a time because Alexandria was unlivable. Now, Rick's eyes fluttering open, as I said, we have not seen this inside the CRM, and I believe we will, but we actually have seen it other times that were foreshadows of that. Okay, the first time was in season 4 when Rick fell asleep and then woke up in the Claimer house. We saw his eyes flutter open. And I do believe that the Claimers and the Claimer house were a foreshadow of the CRM. So, of course, it was a storyline in season 4 that was great, but they're also using that to foreshadow a bigger arc later on. So we kind of have Michonne and him being separated because she went to look for supplies with Carl. But the point is, he woke up in this place. He was alone with these not so good people, and he had to figure out how to escape. Okay, that's probably from a very broad bird's eye view how his arc will go inside the CRM as well. And then we also remember that in season 8, when we lost Carl, he was having visions it was really unclear what they were. I started calling them Rick's old man codas, but they turned out to be just Carl's vision of how he wanted the future to look, in which, Negan had been redeemed and was part of the community, and Judith was older and all of that. And in those, we did see Rick wake up and his eyes flutter open. So I believe that was another foreshadow. So Rick and Michonne united after the trial separation. This is when they had to bury Carl. And then they did have some time to be happy together before Rick's death fake out. So in the early episodes of season 9, we see them just being happy together, trying to rebuild, trying to, honor Carl's memory, spending time with Judith, taking her out and playing with her and reading books to her. And that was their time to be happy as a family. And then, of course, heartbreakingly, the death fake out happened in 905. So that also does follow the pattern. But of course, we haven't seen Rick and Michonne reunite, so we haven't seen them come back together afterward, same as Beth and Daryl. So finally, before I wrap up, I will talk about why I think that Ezekiel will get one. And it is because even though we haven't seen it yet, we have seen a lot of these elements of the pattern with him and Carol. In the first episode of season 9, we saw Ezekiel go through the glass floor. Now, I've talked about this in my posts, but anytime we see anybody breaking the plane, which means they go through the floor or through the ceiling, up or down, it represents straying into the realms of the dead. So it's like if you fall through the floor, it's almost like falling into the underworld. But what happened is he didn't fall all the way down. He didn't die. They grabbed his hand and pulled him back up. Now, coming back up through the floor is a little bit like resurrection. It's symbolic of that. But it also shows that he sort of flirted with the idea of death, but he didn't actually die. He was pulled back into the land of the living. We saw that at the big spot when the walker came through the roof. And I believe that that was a foreshadow of Beth's death fake out. So Ezekiel falling through the floor of the museum in 901 was a foreshadow of his death fake out, okay? Didn't happen in season 9, didn't happen in season 10. We're still waiting for it, but that foreshadow is there. And like I said, I do think that the timeline has been pushed back. Like maybe we would have seen that in season 10 or early in season 11. But again, just because things changed, we had Melissa McBride changing her mind about the spinoff. I mean, they've had to kind of reshuffle things. So things might not have happened quite as soon as they had originally planned for them to happen. Obviously, they are already canon, so the relationship is established. In terms of their trial separation, I actually do believe that we're kind of in the middle of it right now. I think their trial separation was Carol leaving him after Henry died and her deciding that she just couldn't be with him anymore. Okay. It's really more of a relationship thing than a location thing, although she often is not in the same location with him or wasn't at first. So that is their trial separation. And here in season 11, we actually are starting to see them gravitate toward each other again. And it's looking like they'll start to get back together. And once they are fully, completely back together, we're living as husband and wife again, you know, the relationship is there, then I think they'll have a short time of doing that, and then the fake out will happen. So again, following the template, they're actually not quite there yet. They need to come fully back together before the death fake out can happen. The place they lost as the separation began was, of course, the kingdom. Remember, the pipes were not working and they all had to leave it in the final episode of season 9, which was the storm. I don't think we've seen Ezekiel's eyes flutter open. Sounds like such a funny thing to say. I don't think we've seen that. Not that I've noticed, but again, I don't think that we actually will until closer to or around the death fake out. So because we haven't actually seen this yet, all of the other things like them coming back together before the death fake out, or you know, after the death fake out, realizing he's alive and coming back together after that, we haven't seen them yet. So I can't really point to anything with that, but I think it is on the horizon. Okay, so a couple of other things I'm going to mention just so that you can see that this same kind of symbolism is used other places. We have Al and Isabel in Fear the Walking Dead. We have not actually seen a death fake out with them either, but I believe we're going to. So they had an episode several seasons back where they, you know, their relationship was established. We kind of called it their still episode. So it was for them what still was for Beth and Daryl, where they got to know each other and you kind of had those first seeds of romance blossoming. The main difference is that Al and Isabel did go canon in that relationship. At least they kissed, you know, and then after that they separated. And after that really was their trial separation. Okay, they were in different places. They knew the other one was out there, but they were not together. And then one of the last things we saw with Al is her go to Isabel and them decide to just kind of be together and try to avoid the CRM for the time being. But I'm kind of assuming that's not going to stand in the long run, that they will probably be found and that there will probably be a death fake out for one of them eventually. Okay, so I'm kind of thinking that will be in the future. And because it's Fear, it's not as mainstream as the main show and not as many people are as invested in those characters. So, you know, I don't put as much importance on this particular storyline, but it does look like it's going to play out that way. And then very recently, I've been actually trying to make this video for a couple of weeks, and I'm glad that I waited because we very recently on Fear the Walking Dead had Madison's return. Now, not all of these same things apply to her because she is not a couple. It is just her herself, but she is a massive example of the death fake out. Okay, they said she died. We saw no body. She just disappeared. They did not make it obvious that she was dead, but they said she was dead and leaving the show. And then several seasons later, she turned up. She was alive and well. She's working for an enemy group, which is either they are a part of the CRM or they are, you know, a symbolic foreshadow of the CRM. But the same thing is going to happen with Rick. The same thing is going to happen with Beth. You know, they're going to show up being part of the CRM, which is technically an enemy group, and then have to reconnect with the main group. Okay, so again, it's just they do this in a big way. Even though Madison is not part of a couple, we still see a lot of the same symbolism around her. And one thing that I didn't talk about are the boots. And I'm not entirely sure that this is true of Glenn. And of course, we don't know about Ezekiel, but I know that back in season 4, we had a camera shot where it just showed Beth's boots walking along. That was in Inmates. We saw the same thing with Rick when he did his death fake out on the fridge. They just focused on his boots and the blood dripping on his boots. And then with Madison, they did this when she showed up again. They just focused on her boots. Okay, so boots they're a big symbol. They're a symbol of walking. They're a symbol of journeys. They're in some ways a symbol of the cycle of the death fake out. They might not be a symbol of the fake out itself, but of the resurrection or something like that. Okay, but when they do that with all of these different characters, it just shows that they're all going to be following the same template. One other thing that I do want to mention is what I call the lost foot or shoe symbolism. Every time we see a shoe or a foot that is just kind of sitting by itself, that is how you know that a death fake out is coming. Okay, they do that before all of them. We actually saw it at the big spot where we saw a walker whose foot was dragging behind him and was almost completely severed. We saw it with Beth. She saw a child's shoe next to the train tracks when she was with Daryl and started to cry. We saw it with Rick because in 7:12, he was trying to pull a walker off the car and his foot came off in Rick's hand, which was gross. But we saw it there too. And I know that in that episode with Al and Isabel where they were trying to get to know each other, I think Al stepped in the mud or something and her shoe came off when she was running and the camera focused on that shoe just sitting there by itself. So they do this every single time too. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that we always look at, and these are the kinds of things that the writers put in purposely to tell us, you know, give us hints about where the show is going. And they're always correct, you know. Just because neither Beth or Rick are back yet, obviously we can't prove it where they're concerned. But when we look at these kinds of symbolism, we're always right about where it's going, okay? Because it's a pattern. So you can look at the old pattern and figure out where it's going with the new, situation. And that's kind of what we do. Okay. We try to figure it out based on these things. We look at the symbols and we try to predict where it's going. Okay. So thanks for listening to this video. I ended up dividing it into 2 parts because it was so long, but I hope you got some value out of it. And now these are things you can look for as we move forward into the last part of season 11. And here's hoping that we finally see Beth. All right. See you guys next week.